course I did myself. I was just part of the policy of all the seminarians there, at least in those days. We did some of our philosophy. There are 2 years that are required on top of your what we call your basic general education type thing. So I did 2 years of philosophy along with everybody else, and completed that in Rome, and then 3 years of theology for the Bachelor of Sacred Theology. And then, unlike some of my confreres, I went on to study the license, which basically translates into a master's degree, where you have to write a smallish paper, you don't have to prove anything original, and you also have to defend publicly, that is in front of other professors or anybody who wants to come, some thesis or other. And then finally I went back and finished my doctorate there in sacred theology in the Thomistic section of the Anglican University. That's the Dominican University there in Rome. And so that was way back in 2000, the year 2000 period. And, I got that degree. Anyhow, it was, which is why I rarely wear it, but this is my doctor ring from Rome, just in case you wonder what they're supposed to look like. Very simple, but they say Roma on them, that is Rome, which is, backwards is amor, meaning love. Anyhow, if that's the significance, tonight I'm planning on spending about 30-45 minutes on the life and the works of St. Thomas, but at least the more salient or interesting points to inspire you, hopefully, to begin to read his works, or if you've already read some, then to delve a little bit further into them and to be faithful to St. Thomas, as I hope to conclude as well. So man just asked, without being too prying or whatever, how many of you have read any of his works, St. Thomas, any of his things? Okay, so we've got a little bit there. I mean, it can be daunting, and so that's why it's helpful to have an overview. But to show, at least I hope, the significance of it, especially since this is the year of the faith, that is our Holy Catholic faith, and there's an emphasis on the new evangelization, and there's some ideas out there, some good, some not so good, which I read about recently. The one thing that's true about, of course, any evangelizing effort is that it begins with the faith. But at least in that particular endeavor, it's also necessary to apply it, obviously, to circumstances and the peoples of our time. And any application of the faith, rather, is properly so called what theology is, because its first premises, theology that is, are the dogmas of the faith. So those are taken for granted, at least within the study of theology, and then human reason is applied to it. Now, a little side note here, our separated brethren, as we've learned to call it, Protestants and so forth, they use theology all the time. They used not to want to admit it, especially way back when, although now they're much more eager to use the term theology, because that's sort of cliche, I suppose. But any time someone says that Christ died for me, meaning you yourself as a person, obviously you're using reason, because nowhere is your name probably found in the sacred scriptures. So you couldn't say that it was a revealed truth, but you know that Christ died for all men. St. Paul says you are a member of the human race, and therefore. So there you have reason applied to the dogmas of the faith, and that is exactly what theology is. And there are many different sources of these dogmas, the way they've been stated, most familiar in all the decrees and canons of the councils of the church, where they most solemnly laid them out after a long dispute sometimes, and then defined them as precise dogma of the faith. Now I want to begin by pointing out something that's very interesting in the history of the church and also the history of theology, and that is to begin with the often forgotten Council of Florence. It was in the middle of the 1400s. It was a reunion council at the 11th hour, trying to bring all the Greeks and the other separated, what we call the Orthodox, back into the Catholic fold. It failed in part, at least in certain areas, because the Ottoman Turks conquered what was left of the Eastern Roman Empire a few years later, and all was for naught, at least in the big scheme of things. However, many very useful decrees and dogmas were issued by this council that moved around to a few cities, but it's usually called the Council of Florence. And this is just a little part from the decree for the Armenians. Now you have to stay with me here for a little bit, because it's kind of long, as a lot of these things are. And it's addressing the point, why do we use a little bit of water mixed with the wine at Mass? And this decree that the Council Fathers, that is the Catholic bishops and the Armenian prelates that were there from what's now eastern Turkey and northern Syria, they said, in part, that wine is mixed with water, there's three reasons. Because according to the testimonies of the Holy Fathers and Doctors of the Church, in a disputation that was made public long ago, that it is the opinion that the Lord himself, as Christ of course, instituted this sacrament in wine mixed with water. And moreover, this is the second reason, this befits the representation of the Lord's passion. For Blessed Alexander, that is Pope Alexander, says in the offering of the sacraments which are offered to the Lord within the solemnity of Mass, let only bread and wine mixed with water be offered as a sacrifice, for either wine alone or water alone must not be offered in the chalice of the Lord, but both mixed. Because, goes on Pope Alexander, it is read that both, that is, blood and water, flowed from the side of Christ. And then the third and final reason, then also because it's fitting to signify the effect of this sacrament, which is the union of the Christian people with Christ. For water signifies the people according to the passage of the Apocalypse, Revelation. The many waters are many peoples. And Pope Julius, Julius I, says, therefore when wine and water are mixed in the chalice, the people are made one with Christ, and the multitude of the faithful is joined and connected with him in whom it believes. So that is the decree to the Armenians, 1430. Now here's the second text. And I know it's kind of long, but this is a little bit shorter. And just know that there are three reasons that are touched on here as well, on the same question about water being put in the chalice before the consecration. Water ought to be mingled with the wine, which is offered in this sacrament, of course, Holy Eucharist. First of all, on account of the institution, for it's believed with probability that our Lord instituted this sacrament in wine mixed with water according to the custom of that country. Secondly, because it harmonizes with the representation of the Lord's Passion. Hence, Pope Alexander says, in the Lord's chalice, neither wine only nor water ought to be offered, etc. Okay? Thirdly, because this is adapted for signifying the effect of this sacrament. Since Pope Julius says, we see that the people are signified by the water, but Christ's blood by the wine. Therefore, when water is mixed with the wine in the chalice, the people is made one with Christ. Now this second citation, which as you may have noticed is almost exactly parallel. In fact, word for word, it has been amplified in the first case with a little bit more explanation. This is all taken directly out of St. Thomas's works. And the reason why I point this out is that nowhere else, or almost nowhere else, will you find the writings of a theologian that has been made into, so to speak, by its adoption by a council, a font of revelation, that is, a source of the dogma of the faith. That's very significant. Even with the other great doctors of the church, St. Bernard, St. Augustine, many others, even though little phrases, snip, and so forth have been used here and there, very rightly so, never has something just wholesale been lifted out of the work of a theologian, so very surely, and then placed into the decree of a council. And that is only one of the things. When they touched on the sacraments, they found, despite what people nowadays think, at least in scholastic circles, that the Greeks and the others in the East, along with the Latins, could all agree on one presentation of the faith, and that was St. Thomas Aquinas. So my question for you, which I hope to explain a little bit, is how did this simple religious, who was never a bishop, never a cardinal or anything like that, how did he become such a towering figure in the history and the life of the church? I'm going to give a brief little sketch about his life. Some of the more salient points, because being of a scholastic aptitude, a lot of it, is pretty uneventful. It's not like he was a king or a crusader or anything. And then something about his works to make it a little bit easier to see how you can begin to read him for yourselves. So he was born around the year 1225, nobody knows for sure. One of the few incidents that's recorded from his childhood is that when he was a little toddler, as we'd say, he was found with a scrap of paper in his hand. The nurse tried to get it out of his hand. He wouldn't let go, even though this was before he even learned to talk or anything. And finally, when they pried it out of his little fingers, they saw that it was a scrap of paper on which somehow or other the name Maria, that is Mary, had been written. Then he was handed over to a monastery. So if you thought your childhood was tough, just imagine, this is in the Middle Ages, his family was the lesser nobility down there in southern Italy. It was all divided up and crisscrossed into little principalities and whatnot. And they wanted, his mother especially, for him to become one day Lord Abbot of the famous Monte Cassino Monastery, which is still there and still very impressive. And so he was made an oblate, as we say, of the Benedictines there. He was handed over to the monks at the tender age of 5, And one of the first questions that anyone remembers him asking one of the older monks is, what is God? That already in that little mind, you can imagine, that he was trying to penetrate the mystery of the essence of God himself. So he never agreed to become a Benedictine. Even though he was an oblate, never took vows, he wanted to be a member of the new itinerant order that were called the Dominicans after St. Dominic, although at that time they were better known as the Order of Preachers. It was a new thing on the earth. They didn't live in monasteries, they had convents, they called them, they still do, and they were never tied to that place like religious of the past had been, but they were able to go from place to place, and they were especially trying to evangelize, that is, to bring the people back to a more living practice of the faith, to make the faith better known and so forth, and also to go out into parts of the world where Christ was not believed, which was basically the Muslim world then as now. It was Northern Africa and the Near East and so forth for the most part, and to bring Christ to them as well. His parents, his mother especially, and his older brothers, the counts of and other nobility of Roccasecca, where his family castle was, did not want this at all. And so to bring him to reason, as they saw it, they locked him up in a room in the castle. And famously, to just get all these ideas of being a religious follower of Christ out of his head and show him that he was just a mere mortal, they introduced a woman of ill fame, as we say, into his chambers, hoping she would seduce him. And St. Thomas also famously took a stick from the fire there that was burning in that cold, no doubt, damp room of the castle, and chased her out, and then slammed the door and drew with the firebrand a cross on the door. And it's said, although it's only known later after his death, when he revealed to one of his intimates, that he had a vision of angels that brought a kind of cincture as a cord the priest wears at Mass, and he bound it tightly around his waist, and he was consumed with pain. But when it went away, he said he never had another unchaste thought or movement in his life. And he was on the road to being that example of angelic virtue. And so his parents relented, his mother, that is, and he was off to join the Dominicans. The Dominicans in those days, unlike now, they never used any kind of conveyance. No wagons, no horses, no mules, anything like that. And so they went everywhere on foot. They really were itinerant. And he was on his way to Paris, where he studied. He would have been about 20 years, a little bit younger than 20 years old, and went from the little university there in medieval Paris, several miles away, what's now Germany, and Cologne, which then was its own little kingdom there under the Archbishop, and then back and forth again. Finally, he was sent to Paris as a bachelor, which is a term we still have, a baccalaureus, because they were awarded a certain kind of staff or rod to show their status as being able to teach. And it was the Paris, if you want to imagine it, maybe in your mind's eye, because now it's a sprawling city with big boulevards and whatnot you see on travel posters everywhere. Then it was much smaller, a little bit bigger than the Isle of Paris, where the Notre Dame rather is, and a few other things. And it was enclosed by a city wall, of course, and very narrow streets, but that was the Paris of St. Louis IX. Our great city of St. Louis is named. It was the Paris of St. Bonaventure and other holy Franciscans and Dominicans, and it was a time of great ferment and discovery in the sciences and the arts and so forth. After all, this was a time when Notre Dame was being completed, which to us looks like a very ancient building, but to them was a kind of architecture never seen before on the earth. It seemed to defy gravity. The walls disappeared, practically giving way to windows only, and so forth. He, at this time, during his years as a bachelor, so around the year 1245 or so, he also traveled on foot again, remember, across the Alps and so forth, down to Rome, because the central part of Italy was ruled by the Pope in those days, and the Pope, knowing his reputation for holiness and learning, often called upon him. Now, the university system, in case you don't know, I see there's some university students here, it was much different than what we're used to, as you might surmise. The three most important things to know before you ever approach a university, what we would call a university, were the trivium, they're called. That is, logic, rhetoric, and dialectic, that is, the art of arguing. So what this meant was that, first of all, you had a thoroughgoing understanding of Latin. When they say grammar, that's what they meant. That you could read that thoroughly. So that should have been done by the time the boy was about 12 years old. Then, on top of that, rhetoric was the use of all these different figures and how they apply. And of course, you can find lots of examples from sacred scripture. St. Paul alone used all these different devices of rhetoric to make an argument. And then finally, the art of the syllogism. Even though St. Thomas was able to greatly advance his understanding himself, nevertheless, it was pretty thorough. And it taught someone how to reason and to find flaws in reasoning. Very sophisticated, something that's not as well appreciated today as it once was, because the works that expounded on it, especially in this century and the one following it, they're all in Latin. And who's going to translate them? So that's the problem. The other part of the studies that were supposed to come before you actually entered the university proper was the quadrivium, that is the fourfold way. And that was mainly mathematics, what we call arithmetic, geometry, a little bit, mainly Euclid. And then two applications of those, music, because they saw it mainly in terms of proportions and so forth. And then finally, what they call astrology, what we would call astronomy, and that was an application of mathematics, mainly to determine one thing. Does anybody know what they used it for almost throughout the Middle Ages? If you get an old breviary, you can still see how that's all laid out. And that is calculating the date of Easter. It's not so easy when you can't go online. Think like, how does the moonlight, the sun, etc. So they needed to be able to do that because all the dates in the church year line up around Easter one way or another. Anyhow, so that was all done. And then armed with this knowledge, then a young man around 14, 15 years old was able to go to the university. And there he would be enrolled under a bachelor, or more likely a master, who would give lectures and then oftentimes would give supplementary instruction later on in the day, maybe 2 or 3 times later on. So that meant that the master was standing there in his chair, which is where this idea of the chair of philosophy, the chair of English and so forth comes from. And the students stood around, of course, sit while he stood. Outrageous in their mind, because he was the master after all. And then he would take the lines of scripture one by one, oftentimes, and just expound them. And of course, in the course of that, there were various questions that arise. Just read the first chapter of the letter to the Romans, for example, and see all the things that St. Paul assumes that someone knows, understanding the Creator's, the God of creation from the things that he has made and so forth. And there's lots of room there to expand. And so it was done. And you might think, well, it's kind of haphazard, because you have to go through so many books of scripture, the Gospels, the letters, Old Testament, and so forth, before all these questions start falling into place. And that was certainly understood in the Middle Ages as well, because there was a great guide to all these questions. It's still around. And it is called the Sentences of Peter Lombard. He was never declared a saint. He had a saintly life. There's been something there because nobody ever took it seriously. Anyhow, his work is very famous. 4 large books, what they call books, we call sections, I guess. And it goes everything from theology, what it is, down to the Last Judgment, and all the questions in between. It's very vast, very detailed, and many of these young bachelors that were newly graduated, as we'd say, they would expound on the sentences of Peter Lombard and St. Thomas Aquinas, the exact same thing, as well as these other things. So the most important part of it was what they called the sacred page. I was explaining the scriptures. And that was what a bachelor and a master did. So his work as a master involved many things. We're talking about 10, 15 years here, where the things he's most famous for was defending, first of all, no one really worries about this nowadays, church historians, that the religious orders had a right to teach. There were very powerful voices at the time that said they should be in the monasteries, they should be praying, working, and so forth, and they had no business being out with the people. So it seems so alien to us nowadays. And it was alien to the thought of the Dominicans, St. Thomas as well. He vigorously defended them. In fact, it's one of his most magnificent moments. If you've ever felt downtrodden because you were getting beat up by some priest with dodgy ideas or professor or something like that, that St. Thomas, in fact, encountered just such a thing where other masters were telling students these erroneous ideas about the role of religious and their place in the university. And he said, let them address their objections to me and not to children, and I will defend it. Now this mild manner in St. Thomas comes out swinging only a few times in all his writings, and that was one, this idea of people taking advantage of those who did not have as much education in these things as himself, because he saw himself, first of all, as a defender of the truth. Secondly, he also defended the use of Aristotle, whose works on logic and the natural sciences, understanding the natural world, and the things that apply to all of creation, what we call creation, that is metaphysics and its ethics and so forth. He expounded them in great detail. He sought eagerly after new and more accurate translations of him and of his Arab commentators. There were a few of those, and they always had, besides their vast learning about Aristotle, they always had some strange ideas that he weeded out. But he also wanted to defend the use of Aristotle against this idea that somehow was heretical, that you could only follow what St. Augustine long ago had said. And of course, it so thoroughly vindicated the use of Aristotle that from his day, practically uninterrupted into our own times, that is the only kind of logic and natural philosophy, metaphysics, that was ever seriously taught in Catholic universities up in our own days. And then finally, he was very conscious of the fact that it's hard to, for students, at least a lot of them, to gather all this different stuff, information about theology in such a haphazard way as I tried to describe. And so he compiled manuals for them to be able to understand better the basics of philosophy they would need, and also theology. And so he began with this famous short little work that if you ever want to take a long time reading a short book, then I recommend this, because it is called On Being and Essence. That is, beings, individual things, and the essence of things, to get these different terms clear in the minds of his students. And he does it with as few words as possible, the exact opposite approach that we take nowadays, and very concise, very clear. It is a classic. It talks about being as an action, beings as things, and the essence of things that makes them to be the way they are, and how they are interchanged. Likewise, he wrote commentaries on almost all of Aristotle's works. And that is more of the domain of a philosopher who wants to really delve into them, because he is technical. It is not a kind of a happy, friendly approach to philosophy. He is very rigorous in his thinking. So the commentaries on logic, on the natural sciences, and so forth. There's some interesting things there, though, that if you ever did delve into them, you would see. I give you an example. He has a commentary on the meteorology of Aristotle. It's a short little work about weather and patterns of weather and so forth, and as well as it could be known there. And he says in one passage, does St. Thomas, commenting on all this about the sun and the other planets revolving around the earth, as was commonly accepted, that he acknowledges it's an opinion, and it could be changed one day by further observation. Something that probably no one would ever imagine that people in the Middle Ages would think of. Of course, much more careful thinkers than their modern critics, perhaps. Likewise, besides the regular instruction that he gave as a master during these years, as a bachelor, he also held public disputations. That was a very big event in the life of the university. And there were two, one in Advent and one in Lent. And then there were others that were held at when someone was trying to get their bachelor's or master's degrees, and for certain other big occasions like that. So it consisted of this, that the question thesis was published, that is, it was put out there for all the students and masters to see at the University, let's say in Paris, which wasn't, you should imagine, this big complex of buildings like this place. But there were various halls that belonged to the different religious orders and the Bishop of Paris and whatnot, and that's where their students lived. That was the university. It was just all of them aggregated together. So if this question be published about all the houses there, whatever it might be, that all things are made of act and potency, let's say, just as an example, I'll use a dry one. And then all the masters and students as well, they could all write down their objections, saying why that wasn't so. That all things, like just take one for instance, he's thinking the way they were, that God is pure act. There is no potency or anything in him waiting to happen, so to speak. And all his creation is a reflection of God. Therefore, it is unfitting that there should be any potency in his creation. So it's an easy objection. You can put it right there. And many others besides, whether drawn from Scripture or just natural reason, whatever. And sometimes there would be 20, 30, 40, 50 objections, however many that flowed in. And the master had to acknowledge them all. They were read out loud. And then he gave his thesis, the basic reason why it was false, to contradict his thesis. And then he would explain it himself. And then one by one, you'd have to answer each one of the objections. So it wasn't like people were silenced and told that your opinion doesn't count, or you have to shut up, or this is a ridiculous point, or anything like that. They had to take them all on board. And there are many, not as dry as one I just gave, there are many, many interesting theses that were disputed in this way in public. The ones, and they're from other people besides St. Thomas, but his are the best known. And there are two big collections of them. There are the disputed questions. They're called On Truth. There are two big old volumes of all the disputed questions that he handled. And just to give you a little tidbit of what it was like being in the Angelicum, where I got my doctorate, one of my professors I have a great deal of respect for, was a real Thomist of the old school. We went through some of the disputed questions in this one particular class. And for the exam, which was always an oral exam, continuing that old tradition, he picked out one of the objections. I think there were like 25 of them for this particular one, and asked me, how does St. Thomas answer that? And I was like, I don't really remember in this precise moment. That's a lot to keep in your mind, if you're looking at all these things. Just think, that's just the disputed questions on truth, and that goes on evil. Some of them are called just the whole nature of truth, nature of evil, and some others that are tacked on there as well. And then there are two volumes, not as thick, on the quadlivital questions. Those are the ones, the disputations that were held in Advent and Lent. It's very satisfying to mind because almost every kind of objection that you can imagine is brought up. Things that most Catholics would never even consider because we're just not anymore in that kind of atmosphere where anybody can bring up a reasonable objection, and you have to be able to answer it either from authority, like the Scriptures and the Fathers and so forth, or from reason alone. For instance, that the world was created cannot be known by reason alone. That was created in time. Now, most Catholics never think about that, why would they? But there is, but it suddenly becomes relevant with modern scientists, for instance, who want to say that no, there could be a Big Bang, but there was something before that, and something before that, and so forth. You turn to St. Thomas, well, that can't be true in Catholic faith. St. Thomas is not going to be much comfort for someone, at least on the realm of reason, because he will say and defend in these disputations and elsewhere that reason, just all by itself, without the truth of the faith, can never know whether the material world is eternal or not. How could they be so subtle? And that's not to say they didn't believe that God is the creator and that all things depend on him. Not at all. There is a great deal of sophistication in the way they thought. It says we would not know it if God had not told us in the beginning. God created the heavens. And one example. Anyhow, he also, because of his fame, especially as the years went by, he was consulted by many, many people. Nobles, the king himself, St. Louis, many cardinals, bishops of the faith, the Pope himself, and he was expected to answer all their questions, some of which were not, on the level of what we've been talking about. So to do this, St. Thomas was given eventually 3, sometimes 4 secretaries to write down his answers. So they were writing, this is no typing going on, they're just writing it down in that medieval shorthand. They had their abbreviations and so forth, and they could write pretty fast, but still, they were writing by hand with the old inkwell and all that. St. Thomas was able to entertain 4 different lines of thought simultaneously. So he could start with this one, go to the next one, the third one, and the fourth one, and then pick up the thread over here. So they were all continuously writing, which is truly astounding.
Did he ever have his IQ tested?
Say again?
Did he ever have his IQ tested? Is there any information out there on what was IQ like?
Oh, I don't know. Somebody would surmise it. But it would be